In this video, I'm going to introduce modeling mode, a new editor mode in Unreal Engine 4.26 that will give you a set of 3D modeling tools you can use directly in the world viewport. So the first thing you need to do to use modeling mode is you need to turn it on, because modeling mode is an experimental plugin and it's not enabled by default. So to do that, you go up to the edit menu, plugins, and type modeling in this search box. And you'll see modeling tools editor mode, and you just click this box to enable it. I've already done that. And then when you do that, you're going to get a pop-up asking if you want to enable a beta plugin, and you click yes. And then you're going to have to restart the editor for that editor mode to load. There's no other plugins you need to enable, just that modeling tools editor mode plugin. So once you've done that and restarted the editor, then when you click on this modes drop-down, you'll see that there's a new mode, modeling. You might have some other modes in here if you've enabled other things, but modeling mode is the one we're going to use in this tutorial. So if I switch to modeling mode, you'll see that on the left side here in the panel, there's currently nothing, and you'll see why. And then we get this toolbar with a bunch of tabs. And so now I can explain what modeling mode does, which is it does a lot of things. We have tools for primitives. We have tools for doing things like drawing and extruding polygons and cutting them and doing Booleans and some sort of voxely operations. There's tools for doing things like editing the pivot or baking transforms into a static mesh. There's 3D sculpting tools, plane cutting, offset surfaces, smoothing, displacement, space deformations. This is a bunch of poly modeling related stuff I'll get into a little bit. Triangle processing tools like simplification and remeshing. UV tools, some basic UV tools, tools for setting normals and tangents. Some tools for converting between meshes and volumes in BSP, and some physics collision authoring tools, and even a few tools for manipulating new hair features, which we're not going to get into, and these are just sort of incidentally in this mode right now. Clearly there's way too much here to go over in a reasonable length video. So what I'm going to do in this tutorial is I'm going to show you the basics of operating modeling mode and how the sort of overall tools work, and in future videos I'll dive into individual tools. So the main thing to understand about modeling mode is it is for editing static mesh assets. So Unreal, the static meshes are sort of your main non-animated meshes in Unreal. If you've used Unreal before, there's things like BSP. So this is not for something like BSP. This is for editing static mesh assets. So when I have static meshes in my scene, I'll just put a few in here. We'll see that different tools will activate depending on what's selected. So if I clear my selection, you see a lot of these tools are grayed out because they can't do anything right now. The ones that are still enabled are tools that create new static meshes. If I select this bunny, now I can sculpt it. There's a bit of 3D sculpting. If I select two things, then some tools no longer work, but some do. So it really depends on the tools, but that's the main thing, is that it's for static meshes, and that's going to come up a bunch of times in this video. So basically these buttons each correspond to what we think of as tools. So when you click one of those buttons, you enter a tool, and then you exit the tool in some way or another. So if I start the box primitive tool, now I can place boxes. I'll show that in a little bit. When I'm done, I click complete and I exit the tool. And then there's other kinds of tools. Actually, let's go back into the box tool. So basically, once I'm in a tool, I get a panel over here with settings. There's a little bit of help text at the top. And usually there's some in viewport interaction involved. Some tools you just change properties and you'll see a preview of some operation in the viewport, but many of the tools have some kind of pointy clicky interaction here in the viewport. So I've got this box, I can place it on things, right? You can see I could drop a box on my character here. If I change this target surface, I can put it on the ground plane only. I can change the height, maybe make it taller. So that's basically the panel affects what happens with the tool in the viewport. I'm not going to go through even all of these options in just this tool. That's going to be a recurring theme, is there's going to be lots of options in each of these tools. But I am going to create a new box so we can just see what happens, right? So if I click, that places a new box in the scene or in the level. So what you see now is that if you notice it happening is down here, a new box was created. So it's named box, and it's got this randomly generated string after. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the main thing here is this is a normal static mesh asset you see over here. It's a static mesh component. This is a static mesh actor. We can open this up in the static mesh editor. You right click or double click, just like any other static mesh you've imported. So that's basically the critical thing, is that these are static meshes just like any other static mesh in Unreal. So I can also just drag in more instances, right? And then I can go here. I'm going to go just use a simple editing tool here. I'm going to move this, right? I'm going to click OK, and you're going to see that it affected all of them because those are all instances of this static mesh, right? I just dragged this one in 3 times. So that's one of the first things to wrap your head around, is that although I'm working in the viewport on an instance, I'm editing the underlying asset in most of these tools. There are a few tools that work on the instances, but in general, the tools are actually working on the asset. It's a little unusual to do that here in the main viewport instead of in the static mesh editor, but the reason for that is so that we can edit in context, so that I can make changes relative to what I see around it and not in isolation, which is what you would get in the static mesh editor. So just going to mention one sort of gotcha with that, with the tools in that respect, is that it's pretty common to use, historically in Unreal, to use these default static meshes, right? If you have a place actors tab, you've got like a default sphere, right? And I can drag that in and use that as a sphere in my game. If I want spheres, I can resize it. If you use these tools on that sphere, like say I go back in here into the sculpting, and I do a bit of sculpting on this sphere. Let's use the other one, right? I do some edit like this. It's a dynamic mesh sculpt. It's pretty cool. And I click accept here. I'll talk about accept in a little bit. Now if I drag in another sphere, you see it's already edited because I changed this underlying sphere asset. This sphere does correspond to an asset. You can always get to the asset in the content browser by right clicking and going browse to asset, or Control B shortcut. I use that all the time. And you see that, you know, it's somewhere here in engine content, and comes with all Unreal games. There's a set of these default primitives, and you see we've edited that one. So I'm going to undo that. Edit. And it goes back. You see undo and redo apply to the assets as we change them. And I can click back here in the content browser to get back there. So that's just an important thing to note. It's a little risky to mess around with these built-in assets. It only affects your project, but it does affect that underlying asset. Okay, so let's get rid of these extra ones, and we'll just play with this one. Just so you know, the F key focuses on, when you select something, is focuses on the selection. That's really useful in modeling mode. And also, you might notice that I'm kind of orbiting around the object. The sort of standard, right, camera controls in Unreal are sort of first-person controls where you hold right mouse and use WASD. But also, if you hold down the Alt key and use your mouse buttons, you can do Maya-style camera controls, which is often a lot more useful when you're modeling a specific object. Okay, but let's talk about accept cancel, because that's also a little bit different than DCC tools you might be familiar with. So here, if I'm going to start the plane cut tool, and now I get a plane I can apply to this object, right? And I have these accept and cancel buttons. So this is an operation that's kind of in progress. I'm working actually on a preview of that object, and I can click cancel, and it just goes away, right? And if I click accept, then it's going to bake it into the asset. And you see now down here the preview changed, and the asset is modified. You know, so that kind of makes sense because that's a kind of atomic operation. But it also works that way for something like sculpting. So I did that a bit of sculpting before. You know, if I make multiple sculpt strokes here, when I'm inside the tool, I can undo and redo those strokes. But if I want to apply this operation, it's not being applied right now to my asset. It's being applied actually sort of on a preview that only exists inside the tool. So if I click accept here, now it's updated the asset. The screenshot angle is not great there, but you can see kind of that it's there, right? And now if I undo, I can only undo and redo the entire change. So that's something to keep in mind when you're working. If you've done like a lot of sculpting on something, it can be good to just accept and restart the tool every once in a while to kind of save a checkpoint. That's just a current limitation of these tools, is that they work this way, and something we're we're looking into, but that's how it works right now. Okay, so I just got rid of that. So one thing you'll notice is that there's, as I go back to my modeling mode tab here, there's this panel down here of modeling mode quick settings, and these are super critical. They're the only thing that's always in this panel, and I'm going to explain why. Because these tools make and edit assets, there is an aspect of managing those assets that is different than normal DCC tools, where you would have like a scene file and everything's just part of the scene, right? Unreal, you have levels, but levels don't really have anything in them. They just have references to content. And so when you want to make a new mesh, you're making new content, and the level then has a reference to it, but the content's a separate file. And so there's some aspect of having to manage those files. So for example, I'll show you one sort of artifact of that is if I make a new box here. So let's make a different primitive. I'll make a cone. If I make a cone, I place that cone. Now if I undo, the cone is going to go away in the scene, but the asset doesn't go away. We never delete assets automatically. We feel that that's very dangerous because it might not be what someone's expecting, to lose the actual asset file, because we can't recover that. So undo and redo will affect changes, but they won't affect new assets being created. So that's just one thing to know. In the same sense, we have to put that somewhere. So you'll see here I've got generated asset settings. The location is set to current folder. So that means when I create a new asset, it's going to place it in this folder. That's what's been happening. That's actually not the default. I set it to that, and that's my preference when I'm using modeling tools. I like modeling mode. I basically tend to keep in mind a current folder, and I work in that folder. But if you're working on a big game project, there might be certain locations you want things to go, or need to have things go. So we have some other options. One is auto-generated folder world relative. If I switch to that, you'll see that when I create, say, a new arrow primitive, it's going to create this underscore generated folder, and the asset's going to go in there in a subfolder with my name, and then it's going to, so now here's the actual asset with this auto-generated string underneath. And you can control all three of those things. So if I go back to the top, if I click on this little gear here, you can configure the name of that auto-generated folder, so it's hard underscore generated. You can change that. You can change whether or not it stores in a per user subfolder and whether or not it appends that random string. So those are useful. This option here is a kind of fallback for the other mode I'll show you, which is autogen folder. Oh, sorry. So global, I picked the wrong one here. Global always goes in the top level folder. So that is what I just did, because my level is also in the top level folder. So if, well, disk's no good, you can't see a thing. So that's also, when it's in global, it's going to be the same folder. But if I make it world relative, and say I have my worlds organized into subfolders, like I go here, a sample map folder, I've got this other map. Oh, this brought up an interesting thing, which is saving. So this is something I meant to show you later, but let's just talk about it right now before I talk about this autogen folder, is that the assets, you need to save them. And if you don't save them, you'll get these dialogues when you go to exit Unreal. I'm sure you're familiar with these. Basically, you need to keep this in mind, that when you close the editor, if you haven't saved those assets, they're not going to be saved, or if you haven't saved changes. So I'm just going to save everything now so we can switch here and come back. So now I went to this other map. If I go back to modeling mode, create a cylinder, I've got this set to world relative now. It's going to create a new generated folder next to my map. So that's what world relative means. And so if you have lots of maps and you want to keep the assets separate for each map, that's a good option. Okay, so let's complete that and go back to our other map and talk about the saving options. I'm not going to save that stuff. Okay, so back to modeling mode. You'll get used to the hotkey. Okay, so those are the location options, and also there's the save mode option. So manual save. When I'm in manual save mode, when I create a new asset, it's going to be initially unsaved. Oh, I want to change this back to current. Right? So current folder. There we go. Right? So there's my box asset. You see it's got a star. It hasn't been saved yet at all. I can also make things to auto-save new assets so that when I create a new thing, it will initially be saved. So if I do that, let's make a torus, right? Now it started out as saved. However, if I go to edit it, if I go back to my sculpt tools here and accept that, it becomes unsaved. And so there's no auto save everything option. You have to explicitly save those either by like right-clicking and saving or saving the level. And then there's a third option, which is interactive, which if you use interactive mode, let's make another arrow, is going to pop up a dialog each time, allowing you to select a location and name for that asset, and it will initially save it. So this is the kind of safest, this is where you have to organize everything up front mode. Okay. Oh, right. I guess so. And if you click cancel, it won't save it. But I'm going to switch this back to manual save and current folder. Those are the options I tend to use. Okay. So I'm going to delete this guy, get these out of here. So that's basically the sort of different options we're saving. And I'm just going to remind you again a second time this browse to asset command, because sometimes, like you might have actually noticed a minute ago, I placed a box and it didn't appear in the browser down here. That's because it was placed in this other folder. So if I had been here and that box didn't appear where I was expecting, I can just right click and go browse to asset, and it'll jump to that folder where that asset is and let me figure out what to do with it. Maybe I want to move it somewhere else, that sort of thing. And just again, right, I made all these new assets. Now when I go to switch maps, right, I have to decide what to do with those. I tend to, if I have this come up, cancel and go back into the content browser and look to see what things are where and why I haven't saved everything. It is a way when you leave it in manual save to get rid of like sort of temporary assets if you leave them unsaved, but you do have to be careful. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the asset management. I know that was kind of long, but that's one of the biggest things to keep in mind when you're using modeling mode, because it's really unfortunate if you lose work, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, so now in terms of using tools, I showed you accept and cancel. There's some other things that happen when you're using the tool. So one of the things that you'll see popping up that we found that sometimes people are surprised by is we call it the B shader. So the modeling tools, a lot of things in Unreal kind of happen on the editor, happen on the game thread, and tend to kind of freeze up the editor while they're computing. This is a tool that merges objects using a kind of voxel techniques. But I'm just using it to show you something, which is what we have this sort of preview shader that happens. Let's see if I can get it to show up. It has to take long enough. So you see now, this means it's computing. You can't accept while it's happening. But also the editor is interactive while that's happening. So while that long commute is running, I can still change parameters and cancel. Also, I can cancel out and just get out of there. So that's something to keep in mind, is that we generally don't freeze up the editor. So it's kind of safe to try large values, and you can always cancel if something is taking too long. Okay. Here, let's put this box back in here and just talk about Booleans for a second. So a few really common tools that have an interaction that's relevant in terms of this asset question are tools like the Boolean. So we have mesh Booleans. They're quite nice, and you can, while the mesh Boolean is active, even manipulate the input primitives, change here. You could change it to an intersection or a subtraction, that kind of thing. But the other thing you can do here is you can control the output. So by default, when I'm doing this Boolean operation, it'll write to a new asset. So if I click accept here, it's going to create a new bunny, right, that's got that chunk taken out of it. It also deleted the input assets. That was the setting in the tool. I'm going to undo that so we can just see that again. If I do that Boolean, you see the settings here were new asset, output name was a Boolean underscore, and it deletes sources. You could also have it hide the sources, keep the sources. But what you can also do is control if you want to write to one of the existing assets. So there we could do something like update the input asset, and then it's not going to create a new asset. I don't actually want to mess up my bunny here. Let's maybe do that on, say, a box and a and this guy. And I'm gonna do that Boolean. Right, ooh, it's very dark. Intersect. You see we did the intersection. If I say I'm gonna update the first input asset and accept, now I've just, you know, changed my cone, and now I've got this cone segment. So that's really useful. You'll find out if you are trying to edit your blueprint actors with static meshes in them, that you often don't want a new asset. You want to update one of the existing ones in these tools that combine assets. So you can do that with Booleans, and you can also do that with the combine tool. Oh, I'm going to undo that, delete. Under transform here, if you want to combine two assets, you get the same options, new asset, or update one of the first or second, and delete or keep sources. So this will just append the meshes together. So if you want to build up an assembly of pieces, you can do it that way by combining multiple times into one of the input assets. Because if you have blueprint actors, you don't want to replace those with a new static mesh actor. Okay, and if you combine things and you want to get them apart, that's also possible. So here we've got, this is a sort of default ball. So there's a tool that will let us select regions. We start this select tool. You'll find it in multiple tabs because it's kind of a utility tool. And this is like a paint triangle selection tool. So I'm not gonna go into all the details here. There's a lot of options, but I'm gonna show you if you use this connected mode, you can basically click to select subregions. These are different disconnected regions. And then there's a separate tool here, or separate operation. So a few of the tools, I'll just mention this, I guess this is a good time to mention it, is that a few of the tools have kind of sub operations with buttons in these panels. So here we've got this separate triangles operation. If I click that, you'll see I just got a new mesh over here. And if I click accept, now where did that asset go? Oh, there it is. It just didn't have a preview yet. So it made a new asset with that piece, right? It kept the same pivot, right? But now I've got that piece separated out. Okay, so that's how you can, if you import, for instance, a big assembly of parts and you want to separate it out, that's one way to do it. Okay, so let's get rid of all of this stuff. Okay, so I showed you primitives, right? You can make all these different kind of basic shapes, and in a little bit I'll show you some editing tools for those, but we've also got a few other tools for drawing more general shapes. And the one I'm going to focus on right now is the Polygon Tool. This is a tool that I use constantly. It might not be obvious right away that that's the tool you want. But what this tool does is it lets you draw and extrude polygons, right? So I'm going to undo that though. So this lets you kind of build out and block out level geometry and that kind of thing. And this tool has a lot of, for example, snapping options. And I'll show you. So let's just draw some basic stuff here. I'm going to draw this out. You see it'll snap to right angles. It will even snap to things like same length lines. So there you see those two little ticks mean those lines are the same length. I'm just going to, draw some random stuff in here. So once you've closed off the polygon and you move the mouse up and down to set the height, and you'll see that creates a new asset. So if I browse to asset on that guy, there it is. There's the new extrusion I created. So each time we do this, it's going to make a new asset. So there I was drawing on the ground. Actually, it was drawing a little bit under the ground, you see, because it was on the ground plane here. So I'm just going to complete this and move it up. So you can move it up and hit end, and that'll drop it onto the ground. So this plane you draw on, you can move it around with the controls like this. But what you can also do is you can control click on the scene to position that plane. And we use this plane in Gizmo in a lot of our tools, and so this is a really useful interaction to know. You can also do things like pick up a reference. So here I've got it aligned with that face, and then I can shift click, and you can kind of see how I can shift click here maybe. It'll stay aligned with the face, with the normal of the face I picked it up on, and so it's just moving it around where at the click point. So that's really useful too. And there's also a lot of snapping options. So for instance, if I want to extend this out here, I need to draw something that's the same width which could be kind of tricky, but what I can do is I can snap to points in the world. So you see I can snap on the plane, but I can also snap to things like world vertices, and it'll project on the plane. So if I start here, now I'm drawing in that, along that edge there, effectively. And I could, maybe come over here and draw a little bit this way, and then up here. Okay, and now you see I'm drawing out a thing that's the same width, or the same height. And then, I said before, you pull out to set the height, but also you can use the scene geometry. So you see when you see that red X, it's basically using the hit point to determine the depth. So if I put my mouse over this back face here, you can see that now I drew something that's basically lined up. There's a bit of Z fighting even, because it's kind of exactly the same height. If I'd been more careful before, I could have drawn this top at a right angle, and then these things would have exactly mated together, but I was a bit sloppy. And so I can do that, use that to draw kind of ramps and things like that. It does require a bit of sort of planning ahead, right? If I want to draw a ramp here so that my character can run up, if I start out here, I don't know exactly where to draw, but if I use these points as a reference, I can start up here and then hit that one, and now I can drag out my ramp and be able to get the points I need. So there's a bit of a planning aspect, right? And so now I've got my little level here. I can click play. Is it shallow enough? Yeah, I can just directly work on it, right? And if that ramp was too thick or too steep, for instance, I can go over to PolyEdit tool, and you see I can click on the faces. So I had that object selected. That's why I can just jump into PolyEdit on that object, right? I can select that edge. I could move it in. Now it's too steep. I can make it less steep, and I can kind of iterate and things like that. I could, maybe change this. Go in here and do this one. So I can, there's not snapping for everything. So for instance, these positions here I can't snap, but actually you can snap these to the grid. So we could use grid snapping. Right now it's set to 10 units. So I think that's too small to hit that exactly. But so the PolyEdit tool, I guess we could fix this. That's another thing we could do in PolyEdit, is we could get rid of that Z fighting. You can use to kind of reshape these things. The PolyEdit tool has lots of other operations that I'll go into in a minute. But that's the basics of the Draw Polygon tool. The very, very basics. There's really a ton more in there. There's things like the local and global snapping. There's rotation snapping. I guess that's a useful thing to show. Which is that when you're using the gizmo, it currently respects the grid snap. So if we change this to be much larger, you'll see that snap to world grid. If that's on, then it's going to snap to that world grid, and also the draw point will snap to the world grid. If you want rotation snapping, you can hold shift while you rotate, and it'll snap to 45-degree angles. You can snap to lengths, angles, all sorts of things in here. The hit scene objects is a good one. So that's one other thing that's pretty useful, which is that, let's turn on snap to world grid. If you turn on hit scene objects, then you can use any, not just vertices, but any scene point. So if I want to draw like a little thing that's aligned here on the ground plane, right, I can use the scene object hit points to make that kind of exactly hit that edge there. So that's just one more thing that this tool does. Okay, so that's Draw Polygon. We've got a few other tools like Polypath. So Polypath more or less works in the same way. It doesn't have as many options, and what it's for is drawing open paths that get thickened into walls. So basically the way it works is when you see yellow, you can click again, and that sets, and then you switch to setting the width and then the height. So that lets you draw those. You sort of thicken paths. You can also draw ramps, and you could draw ribbons. So if we change this to ribbon, it's just going to draw kind of floating planes, which you might find useful for lots of things. And then we've got Polyrevolve. This is the sort of third of the trio, which lets you draw revolves. So basically the way it works is you double click when you're done. I guess I drew that under the ground. And it draws surfaces of revolution. It can also, you turn on this sharp normals option, that's pretty useful to get kind of hard edges. So Polyrevolve works different than the other two that automatically output a new primitive when you're done drawing, in that it's an accept cancel tool. So you can change the settings. I can like dial this in so I get just sharp creases in some places. And there's lots of other options. You can make it inside out. You can control, if you open this advanced display, you can see you can control all sorts of things. How the mesh gets triangulated and things like that. And you can also do partial revolves and things like that. So this is actually quite a powerful tool. Okay, so that's the sort of basic poly tools. So one thing I just want to note, right, I drew these things and I can just run on them right away. That's because they're configured to have complex collision. So if I go into the static mesh editor on this asset, there's a section in here of collision options, and you'll see that the collision preset gets set to block all, which is not the default. So you see that's why there's a reset to default arrow. So when we make new primitives, new shapes, new primitives, or new extrudes and new stuff, we generally automatically set it to block all collision preset and use complex collision as simple. This is expensive and it's not what you'd probably want to use in your final game. You probably want to author custom collision, but I just want to mention that that's the default, that's how we configure things. It's not something that's an option right now that you can control. And then, of course, one thing that often comes up is like you don't necessarily want all these pieces, so you can use that combine tool. So here I'll do this into the first one I selected. So now those two pieces get merged together, and you can still go and edit them with the PolyEdit tool like they're separate pieces, but it allows you to kind of merge stuff and put things together. Okay, so that's the that's the poly modeling. Now you will notice when I'm in PolyEdit, sometimes you see that the faces are triangulated. So this is a non-planar polygon. So, and in fact, I just said the word polygon, but that's actually not technically correct here. These aren't polygons. They are polygroups, and that's the last sort of main thing I want to talk about so that you can understand how these tools work. So if I go back to the box tool, let's just reset this, and let's set this to let's just do 3 on each face. So now if I make this box, you see if I go to wireframe, if you can kind of see it's got different faces, and I'm going to make another one. I'm going to change this to per quad. Oh, look at that, they're snapping together because of the snap settings. Okay, so now they look the same, but these two have okay, let's put that back down. Let's so they are the same mesh, they're the same triangles, and actually there's a tool it might be useful to know. This inspector tool will let you just see in the viewport a lot of stuff about your mesh, right? So these two have the same triangles, but they have different poly groups. So if I go into the PolyEdit tool, you see that this one I'm selecting the big faces like on a cube, whereas in this tool I'm selecting quads. So so the difference isn't something you can see, unfortunately, in the main viewport. You have to start up one of the tools that will show you the poly group. So right now the easiest way to do that is to start this select tool. That's the brush select tool I showed you before, if you remember, for painting triangles. And you can change this face color mode to by group. And you see here, we've got like different color on each face. And if we go to this one, by group, you see that we've got different color on each quad. So the groups are the poly groups are groups of triangles, and then our tools like PolyEdit, our poly tools work on those groups, and so they find edges between groups and they find vertices at corners of groups. So they don't work on the triangles and they don't exactly work on polygons. The polygons are kind of implicitly defined. And that lets you do some interesting stuff, so you can author let's make this smaller. You can, in this selection tool, also assign new groups. So if we go create poly group, now we just created a new one. You see now we've got a polygon with a hole in it. But if we go back to PolyEdit, that's fine. It can still work that way. So we can work on this outside face or this inside face. It doesn't cause any problems like it might in normal poly modeling software. And in fact, we can kind of have arbitrarily complex poly groups. So in fact, this bunny most likely has, because we subtracted, so the polygroups come with Booleans. So because we subtracted sort of stretched out cube, we've got some faces in here, some poly faces, but also we have one face for this whole bunny. And we can go back into like the select tool, and maybe create a polygroup there. And now when we go to PolyEdit, now that's a separate poly face, and we can select that and move it independently. And you see, we do, I'm not going to get into this in this video, but when you're editing a more complex face, right, when you're editing a simple face like this, well, actually even a simple face like this, we are trying to find a good, kind of soft deformation of the surrounds. So if you see, the mesh is like smoothly deforming rather than just rigidly moving that face. But when you're on a simpler shape, like something like this, it is going to basically become a rigid movement like you're used to if you have a very low poly input shape, like you would in a poly modeler. So that's kind of interesting. And then the PolyEdit tool has a lot of operations in it, these sub operations. So you can do stuff like, okay, we're going to extrude this poly face, and maybe, let's see, inset it. We can do a bit of an inset, and then we can extrude some more. So we can build up sort of arbitrarily complex shapes using these tools. I don't know. I'm not myself actually very good at this kind of thing. Extrude. But you can build up these kind of structured models using polygroups, and quite a few of the other tools can use the polygroups. So for instance, the UV tools can operate, you can basically solve for UVs based on polygroups. So I can, actually I can probably even show you that. Ooh, maybe it's not. Let's not get into that right now. But based on those, on painted polygroups, for instance, I can do UVs on this bunny and that kind of thing. That'll be a topic for a future video. Okay, so one other thing I'll show you, because if you import models, they aren't going to have polygroups. So I'm going to jump to the third person example map. I'm not going to save any of this. So, and this is, as I was mentioning before, this can be quite extreme. You might end up with a lot of unsaved assets, and you can just save all. You can be more careful. I don't want to keep any of this, so I'm going to not save any of it. So here's an example where this is the sort of default level, right? If I start PolyEdit on this shape, it doesn't have any poly faces because these are default static meshes imported from something else that we don't know about their faces. But we do have this Polygroups tool, which will let you configure the poly faces based on basically trying to find regions that don't deviate too much from each other. So once I do that, and then go back to PolyEdit, I can make more structured edits to those shapes. This is a weird lighting artifact. I think if I rebuild lighting, this goes away. One thing I will say is that might seem like oh, that's the wrong bunny. Let's use this bunny. That tool doesn't do a great job on something like this. We can turn up this setting and you see it kind of groups faces, but it's not magic. So it kind of goes off of sharp edges only. So that's the kind of best way to use it. Okay, so that's polygroups. If you do want to edit, like directly edit the triangles of something, like if you have, like for instance, a mesh like this, and you just wanted to tweak like one little vertex here, we also have TryEdit, which is basically a very similar tool. You can select faces and edges and triangles, and I can just tweak this triangle a little bit. And we have some different operations over here where you can do things like if I need one more vertex, I could poke that face. So these are very low level edits, but you might find, especially if you're working on really low poly game meshes where it's not like a structured quad mesh as input, that the TryEdit tool will help you. And these operations here they're similar to the sculpting in that if I do a bunch of operations, I can undo them inside the tool, but I have to accept to kind of commit it. And once I accept, I can only undo or redo the whole sequence of operations. There's currently no history stored for operations inside a tool. Okay. So I'm just going to go back to my map to show you a few general purpose utility tools, and that's going to be the end. Don't save. So remember, I didn't save anything in this map before, so the map's contents was lost. I do still have all the pieces down here. But you definitely want to, if you're working, you make sure you save your map and the assets that you want to hang on to of this sort of temporary assets you're maybe building while you're working. And as I said before, the safest thing to do is save them all, and then you can go back and delete things you don't need once you know that they're unreferenced. Because if they're referenced in the level and you try to delete them, the editor will warn you and say you have to force delete it. And if you see that, that's the sort of danger zone you want to think, am I sure I want to force delete this? Okay, I'm just going to mention a particular toolbar up here, which is kind of general purpose utility tools. So let's just make a couple of primitives here. Make a cylinder, which is under this transform tab. So a lot of these tools are kind of specific to different kinds of mesh editing that you may or may not need to do, but the transform tab is extremely common to sort of switch to. I use it all the time for these few operations that it has. So one, I showed you combine already, so that lets you basically append static meshes together into a new static mesh very quickly. It's not the same as when you right-click and do merge actors. If you might have used that before, that's a much more intensive combine. This is really just for combining the triangles of the mesh, the geometry, and when you're building up these things out of pieces, it's really useful. The other thing is duplicate. So duplicate, if you say I've got my bunny here, and I want to mess around with it, but I don't want to necessarily lose it, and I don't want to I want to mess around on a copy basically. So if I do a normal like editor copy where I'll alt drag or something, that just made an instance, so that will have the same problem we had with the sphere before, where if I edit this one, it's going to affect this one too. So if I want a new one, I need to I can right click down here and duplicate, but that just duplicates the asset down here, and I want one like in the scene at the same place kind of thing. So what I can do is the duplicate tool, and that will let me make a copy, and by default it's just going to append a number here. I can give it a new name if I want to, and then I've got options like delete the source, keep the source, hide the source. So if I just wanted to work on a new copy in this same location, I would delete the source, and you see now down to my content browser I got my original bunny and I've got a copy bunny, and this asset here is referencing the copy now. So if I do something to this one, like sculpt on it a little bit, I've still got my original there. So I can test it out. And also, you may or may not know about this, but I can always go back over here and switch this back to my original. So I can create copies, work on them in place, and then switch back to the original one if I decide I didn't like my changes. Okay, so that's the duplicate tool, which you'll find really useful as you're working. A few other ones in here. There's align. So if I have multiple objects and I want to like put them, next to each other, or like in the same position. So align tool, you can align by pivots or by bounding boxes. So the pivots on these things are at the bottom. So I could align them by their pivots, and I could, align their tops and align X and Y and Z. This box position only affects when you're using bounding boxes, right? So that's aligning the tops, their tops, and I can pick which axes I align on. Here I think, I can switch only X or Y or Z. So this is really useful if you want to like center things on top of each other and that kind of thing. Another thing I can do is edit pivot. So if I created this cylinder, I guess I'll just show you. We also have this transform tool, which just lets you do a few things. Like you can use a gizmo to move things around, the modeling mode gizmo versus the default gizmo. But you can also do this snap dragging thing, and then you can kind of click. Does not seem to be working. Okay, I'm gonna have to look more into that in a second. Oh, there it is. Right, you have to click on the source object and not the gizmo. But basically what it does is I can click some point on here, and now I'm positioning that point on the scene, and I can control whether or not it gets aligned with the normal and things like that. But sometimes when you're doing that, you might, like actually that got flipped over now, right? You might want to have the pivot be somewhere else on a mesh like this. So for instance, I might want the pivot to be centered. So the Edit Pivot tool will let you move that pivot around, either by using the gizmo, right, or I can switch to snap dragging, and I can position that pivot. Ooh, I made a copy. I did a classic thing in Unreal, which is that I alt dragged as I was doing this alt tumbling. That's a thing that happens a lot when you use the alt camera keys. So I can position it on the surface somewhere, or I can use these buttons. If I turn off snap dragging, I can, position it in different locations on the bounding box. So that can be really useful. But one thing to note is that it is updating the asset. So there's a way to manipulate the pivot temporarily in Unreal, but this changes the pivot permanently. So just to be clear about what that means is that, right, if I got this one up here, let's drop that guy down on top of this cube. So these are now instances of each other. So if I edit the pivot on one, maybe make it at the top, when you accept this tool, it's going to automatically move, it's going to move the pivot, so it's going to edit the mesh. So it's going to keep this one in the same spot, but the one over here, it's not going to keep in the same spot, right? Because its pivot now stayed in world position, but in relative position, it was moved. So that's just something to note about the edit pivot. It's a good thing to use up front to kind of set up your asset, but if you use it on something you've got a bunch of instances of, it won't keep their current locations currently. And it's very hard for us to do that because it might be in multiple levels even. You might have the same asset which aren't loaded. So we can't really update all uses of an asset like that. And finally, the other thing you can do is bake a transform. So for instance, maybe I have this thing rotated and I want to put the pivot at the bottom and keep it in this orientation. So one thing I can do there, and maybe I want to non-uniformly scale it. So a lot of you know maybe that non-uniform scaling can be a big problem in Unreal. So what I can do now is I can bake the transform on this. So I have some options. I can bake the rotation or not bake the rotation, and I can also bake all the scale or just the non-uniform scale. So let's just bake the non-uniform. You see over here, my scale is 0.2511. So if I bake the non-uniform scale, I'm not going to bake the rotation, and I accept. Now you see that my scale is now back to 111 because I got rid of the non-uniform, and I kept the pivot in the same location and everything like that. I could also bake the rotation and bake the whole scale. I guess there's no scale now, so let's make it bigger and maybe just do that a little bit more so we can see. So if we bake the rotation and scale, then now the object's pivot is sort of aligned to the world. You see it's got no more rotation, it's got no more scale. So we've edited this mesh, right? If we go into the static mesh editor, it's now this shape. It's not a scaled or translated or rotated version of a cylinder. It's this deformed shape. Okay, so let's close that. So that can be useful for lots of reasons if you've done lots of non-uniform scaling to kind of move things around and you're happy and now you want to kind of turn that into geometry that's safe to use. Like for instance, some advanced rendering features and physics features don't work with non-uniform scale. So that's really critical capability. Okay, so that's the tools in this panel, and that's basically the end of this tutorial. So I didn't really go into what all these different tools do. There's so much stuff in here. If you watch this video and you have questions like, is it possible to do a certain kind of thing, please post in the comments, and I will try to answer those questions, and it'll give me a sense of what to cover in future videos. So that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching, and please try out modeling mode and tell us what you think. Okay, thanks.